Can you all hear me, or do I need a microphone? Anyone's okay in the back? Yeah. It's delightful to be here. I'm very Gentile, as Michael said, and it's a real honor to be part of this convening. As I look at the agenda and who's going to be here, and when I think about one of the foundational ideas of both the Institute and the Humanistic Management Network, it's the idea of looking across function and across disciplines. So they try to bring together business people, academics, and policy. And this feels very comfortable to me. My whole career has been about bridging different domains and different disciplines. I always joked early in my career that I was too practical to be a true academic, and I was too academic to be a true practitioner. And in the early part of my career, that was kind of a problem. But now I think it's become a strength that I can play to. So what I want to talk to you about today, in the next 15 minutes or so, is, as Michael mentioned, a new approach, an innovative approach, I think, to values-driven leadership development. It grew out of my experiences and my work at graduate schools, MBA programs around the world, starting with Harvard Business School and then working with a number of other institutions. The work that I'm going to describe to you now, although it was created with the hope that we would transform management education, it's actually growing well beyond that. And it's currently being used at hundreds of institutions on all 7 continents, well over 500. It's being used, obviously, in MBA programs, which was its original intent. But now it's also being used to a large extent in business organizations themselves, as well as in other professional areas, law and medicine and engineering. So I'm hoping that it might prove provocative or useful to you. But let me just say, before I tell the story of how this developed and what it is, that if you forget everything else I say to you today, there's only one thing that's really the bottom line that I hope you will remember, which is that giving voice to values, or GVV as I refer to it, is about asking a new question. It's about asking a different question when it comes to values-driven leadership. So instead of asking first, foremost, and only, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's an important question. It's an absolutely essential and fundamental question. However, I believe, as Klaus talked about last night, as Michael talked about this morning, as Professor Kuhn talked about a moment ago, I believe that actually there are a core set of values that tend to be fairly universal across culture, across time. We know that from research and experience. And so what we do is we ask a different question. We ask, once you know what you believe is right, how do you get it done? The reason we ask that question is because we're really trying to look at the realm of professional development, practice, practitioner development, leadership development, and a lot of times when we focus only on the question of what is the right thing to do, we never get to the question of action. So let me step back and tell you how this developed. I've been working in the field of ethics, as I told you, for a long time. I was at Harvard Business School. I helped them to develop their first required curriculum, and I taught in that area. And after a number of years, after over 15 years or so, I became somewhat disillusioned with the whole endeavor. And I began to feel that it was really a bit hypocritical, maybe a little bit like checking the boxes. We can say we taught an ethics class, or in our companies we can say we did an ethics training. But I didn't really feel that we were having an impact on people's behavior. You know, we can debate whether that's true or not, but I was judging from, you know, the recurring cycle of scandals, which came up every few years, always. We talked about some of them on the front pages today. And that often featured the very business graduates that I and my colleagues were trying to train. And so that was somewhat disconcerting. It was frustrating. I began to feel that, you know, why am I spending my time doing this? You know, life is short. So I took a step back from this work around that time, and but I had an experience that changed my mind. And the experience was this. I was doing a consulting project at Columbia Business School in New York City. My project was something else, but while I was there, a number of faculty decided to do something, and they showed it to me. They decided to ask every incoming MBA student upon matriculation, during orientation, to answer one question. And the question was, tell us about a time in your professional experience, your work experience, when you were asked explicitly or implicitly pressured to do something that violated your values, and how you handled it. And so I read hundreds of these essays, well over 1,000 over several years, and we learned some things from them. The first thing we learned is that these were people who already had 4, 5, 6 years of work experience. And I could probably count on one hand the number of them who said, I never had such conflict. Most of them had. Secondly, we learned that the kinds of conflicts they were experiencing got very repetitious very quickly. We were all encountering the same kinds of challenges in the workplace. Times when we knew that something was cutting corners in terms of quality, but we didn't feel that we could speak up. Times when we knew that something might be giving an incorrect perception to our audience, whether it was financial reporting, whether it was marketing a product, whether it was communicating to our customers. But we were pressured to just let that message be out there because it would maximize revenue, etc. Times when we were pressured to engage in various forms of bribery or corruption. Times when we were pressured to treat other colleagues in a way that was less than respectful. So we learned that the situations got pretty repetitious. What we learned, however, is that the responses differed. And these MBA students, these young professionals, had some specific responses to these challenges that fell into several categories. So the first category, the largest group, a little less than half of them, said, yes, I had this experience and it bothered me, but I didn't think I had any options. So I just did what they told me to do. That was the largest group. And then there was a small group who said, yes, I had this conflict, it bothered me, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was wrong. But I also didn't think I had any real options. So these people removed themselves from the situation. You know, exit voice or loyalty, these people exited. They got themselves transferred to a different work group, a different manager. Some of them even quit their jobs. But that was a small group. The remainder of the whole group, about a third of them, said, I tried to do something. And a small group of those folks said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried to act on my values, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought this was interesting because these people had so many things in common. They had similar backgrounds, similar level of academic accomplishment, similar level of experiences. They came from the same kinds of companies, the same industries, and they all identified these as challenges that really bothered them. It wasn't as if they were saying, I don't care. But some of them were able to act effectively, and many of them were not. So we wanted to figure out what was the key. So we started to look at these stories a little bit more in depth. And what we learned is that, in the end, the only thing we could say, and I could go into more detail about this, but the only thing we could say is that at some point the people who were able to do this effectively said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started out talking to a friend or a spouse or a partner, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So we thought, well, what do we do with that? I was discouraged again. I thought, I don't really know what you can do from that. I was hoping to have some string you could pull to solve the educational and the training dilemma around values. But then I remembered some research I'd seen years earlier when I was at Harvard, and it was research on moral courage and altruism. And there were several studies. Douglas Honegger and I'm just blanking for a minute there. But anyways, there were several studies, and they looked at folks who had acted with great courage in times of high stakes, high risks. And what they found is that these people all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, as young adults, they'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if? With someone more senior to them, a teacher, a mentor, a boss, a parent even. They'd had the experience of literally pre-scripting and practicing their behaviors. So I thought that was a little interesting, and it bore a little more research. So we started to look at the research across disciplines. This was 6 or 7 years ago. And there was starting to be a lot of research from many disciplines, from psychology, from the neurosciences, even from the field of kinesthetics, that were suggesting that if you want to change people's behavior, rehearsal is hugely important. The positive deviance scholars put it this way. They say if you want to change behavior, rather than asking people to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. So we started to look at this research. There's more of it now than there was then, and we started to think rehearsal is important. So what is it that we rehearse when we're doing education and training around values and leadership in business or in any profession? And then we became a little discouraged again, because typically what we do, and we do this in good faith, and I did this myself, is what we do is we teach awareness and we teach analysis. We teach people to be aware of, to recognize the kinds of values conflicts they might encounter. And then we teach them the models of ethical reasoning that will help them discipline their thinking so they can find their way through the maze of conflicting objectives, conflicting stakes, conflicting impulses. These are both hugely important things. Don't misunderstand me. But we stop there. And what I think becomes really important is that we never take it to the next step, which is action. Awareness, analysis, action. Action becoming, let's ask a different question now. Let's ask, once you know what's right, how would you get it done? And we don't do that partly because we don't have a pedagogy for that. And so what we did with Giving Voice to Values is we created a new pedagogy. We said, let's not use the typical ethical case study, where you tell a complicated story and you end with, what should you do? We decided, let's give people situations where many people would agree what the right thing to do is, not everyone. But let's ask them, how would you get it done? And engage them in that process, that creative problem solving, action planning, peer coaching, rehearsal for action. And we did this by creating a different kind of case study. Our scenarios end with a protagonist who has decided what he or she believes is correct. And they're asking what to do. What should I say? To whom? In what sequence? And then what will the pushback be? And then what would I say? And what data do I need to gather? What positive examples can I draw on? Has anyone ever done this before? Do I need to do this alone, or is this something I do by building a coalition? Is it something that happens in one conversation, or am I trying to change a fundamental systemic issue, in which case I need to think about working systemically? Obviously, some of these scenarios are very, very simple, and they're simply about raising an issue that no one will raise. But often, there are issues that are much more complex, and that involve actually trying to build strategically and tactically toward change. There's a lot more to this. We've identified 7 principles, but one of the ones that's most important is that often when it comes to values and ethics, we think that this is about standing up, stepping our foot and shaking our fist and speaking truth to power. There's a place for that. But often, we're asking people, think about this the way you would think about any other professional challenge. You would do the research. You would think tactically. You would think about who is going to support me, and can I line them up to be supportive? Who's going to be concerned about this? And might I find a way to address their concerns? Or can I think about sequencing this in a much more strategic way? We're asking people to think about ethics and values just as they would think about any other business challenge, because in fact it is a business challenge. It's a part of everyday business. We're trying to normalize the process. So instead of de-skilling ourselves and thinking the only thing that's necessary here is personal moral courage and our own personal character, but to think that beyond that it also involves being just as skillful as we would be on anything else. So we call that the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment, where we ask people, what if you were going to act on this? We don't ask people to commit to it until they actually see a path forward. Because when I asked people, when I interviewed people about times when they had faced challenges, the people who they tell me stories about how they'd acted on their values in business, and those were wonderful. But then they'd also tell me stories about times when they failed to do so. And so when I asked them, why didn't you act on your values? When they didn't, they usually would say something like, well, I didn't think I had a choice. And so what we're saying here is, we're going to spend our time in the professional development context creating choices for you. You still need, as an individual, to take that choice. But we are actually giving you a real choice. We're putting something on the other side of the scale. So this seems like a possibility to you. Now I'm going to wrap up, but I want to just conclude by saying that what we did is we created hundreds of pages of materials, of stories of people who found ways to do this that did not focus on ethical analysis, but focused on action and scripting and what do you do and say. And we made those available for free online, which they still are, and people started experimenting with it. And we were startled by the rapid and enthusiastic take-up of this approach. I've been traveling every week for the last 3 years and going to different places around the world, and it's interesting to me. It is in line with exactly what you talked about. I find just as much interest in this in Asia, in Africa, in South America, in Australia, in Europe, in the US. It's not something that is culture specific. The tactics you may use will be culture specific. But the goal, the personal aspiration to find a way to act in alignment with my core values is universal. So I want to conclude by just saying as you can see, this whole approach is really about just reframing the values debate. It's about focusing on action, which eventually brings you back to awareness and analysis. It's not that we've left those behind, but it's about making this possible. And we do that through 3 reversals. We change what we say we're talking about, we change who we think we're talking about, and we change how we're talking about it. So in terms of what we're talking about, typically when people think about values and ethics in business, they'll say something like, you know, Mary, the clear-cut issues, the so-called black and white issues are easy. It's the gray issues that are challenging. The times when it's not really clear what the right thing to do is. So from an ethical training perspective, let's focus on the gray issues. I actually agree, there's a lot of gray issues. I don't know what the right thing to do is in most of them, but I think reasonable people with goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. And so we decided, let's reverse this assumption. Let's focus on the so-called black and white issues. Let's focus on the issues where most people, not everybody, but most people would agree, this is over the line, this is illegal, this is fraudulent. And then let's say, just because I know it's right, it doesn't mean it's easy to do, so then let's say, how do I get it done? And the reason we do this is because if we focus only on the gray issues, we never get past the analytic debate. In fact, sadly, from my many years of teaching and sitting in on business school classrooms, I think often these classrooms become schools for sophistry. Because what the students learn is how to justify anything. And that's really not what we're intending. And so what we want to do is say, let's go to those situations where most of us would agree, and then let's just say, what if you wanted to do the right thing? How might you get it done? So that's the first reversal. We focus on shifting what we're talking about. And ironically, I think it makes us better at dealing with the gray issues when we do that. The second flip is who we think we're talking to. Typically, when I go into business schools or into businesses, they'll say, you know, Mary, most of the people here are good people. It's just a few, we call them bad apples in the US. There's just a few people who really are the problem. So, but nevertheless, we're running a training program as if the whole focus is to change the bad apples. So I think we need to think of our audience differently. We think of our audience as a bell curve. This is based on some research by Greg Dees and Peter Crafton on ethics and negotiation. And we say one tail end of the bell curve are the people who would self-identify as opportunists. People who would say, I will always do what I think will maximize my self-interest. Values be damned. And then there are some people at the other tail end who will say, I'm an idealist. I will always act on my values, regardless of the impact on my material self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there. And we call them pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values. as long as I feel that it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Which is not the same as saying as long as I know I will never pay a price, or as long as I know I will succeed. It simply means I think I have a chance. And if we think of our audience that way, I don't believe I have the power to change the opportunist. I think the opportunist will always be with us. And I'm not as worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more skillful. But we're focusing on the pragmatists and saying, we want to give you the skills, we want to give you the tools, the positive examples, and importantly, based on that research, we want to give you the rehearsal to be who you already want to be at your best. That's our target, okay? And then the final flip is how we do this, and I've already described this to you. Instead of asking what's the right thing to do, we ask once you know what's right, how do you get it done? Those three reversals have been hugely powerful. I think it takes the work of values-driven leadership out of the realm of thou shalt not, which is a realm of constraints on action, which tends not to appeal to people of action, the business professionals who are trying to build institutions and enterprises and to make money and to lead, but to take it into the realm of can-do, of innovation, of creativity, which draws on their aspirational values and draws on something that is inherently motivating for them to move them forward. It still may end up leading them to behave with restraint, but we're shifting the conversation in a way that appeals to a different aspect of them. I'm going to just stop there except to say one more thing, which is this is a wonderful design in this conference going across function, but also across issue. And you're going to hear a little bit this afternoon from some business examples who've been using giving voice to values, but you're also going to hear from some folks who are going to talk about whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is hugely important. There are times when stakes are so high that it becomes absolutely essential. But I wanted to just say that I think giving voice to values and whistleblowing fall into this sort of continuum. And we designed giving voice to values to be, to build the skills in people so that to the degree that it's possible, they become more capable to effectively raise issues before it gets to the point where whistleblowing is essential. Quite often people who are whistleblowers have tried to raise these issues internally and through internal channels before they got to the point of realizing that they needed to go outside to make change. But when they do that, as I'm sure you will hear later, it's a very challenging experience. It can be very costly for everyone involved. And so what we wanted to do was to the degree that it was possible, to build the skills, to build the experiences, to build the capability, and to build the audience in organizations to be willing to hear these issues before they necessarily got to the point where whistleblowing was essential. So I think we exist on a continuum, and I hope that will be a really useful part of the conversation. So thank you for letting me share that with you.